So welcome everybody. My name is Sylvia Lappick. I'm the Director for Access System Redesign in Their Futures Matter. And my role involves leading a redesign of the child wellbeing and child safety access system so that we can better connect families with the right supports at the right time. I'm therefore very pleased to be here for this breakout session, which is titled Child and Family Wellbeing and Safety. The speakers in this session will reflect on how children make sense of their wellbeing, as well as an understanding about how to best support parents. The first presenter is Dr. Tobia Fattore, Senior Lecturer in Sociology at Macquarie University. Dr. Fattore's empirical research is in the broad areas of sociology of childhood and the sociology of work. Currently, he is coordinating lead researcher on a multinational study which is investigating how children experience wellbeing from a comparative and global perspective. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Fattore to the stage.
Thank you for the very warm introduction, and also thank you everyone for being here today. Look, I'll try and keep it to 20 minutes and kick it off. And I just wanted to talk today about essentially an alternative kind of framework for understanding children's wellbeing, which develops from a child's standpoint. There's some tables which are floating around. I think they might be at the in the front row in a pile. So if you want to have a look at them and send them around, that would be great. So I suppose my starting point is to say that research and practice directed at child wellbeing has given increasing emphasis on tracking outcomes for children. I think Their Futures Matters is an initiative that demonstrates that very explicitly. And this is part of an attempt to redirect attention in child service delivery away from compliance, in part, to more child-focused policy and practice, or at least that's one of the intentions. So what I want to do today is provide a brief overview of existing work on child wellbeing, some of which you heard this morning, I think, on child wellbeing indicators, and discuss some of their limitations very, very briefly before presenting some details of a multi-stage qualitative study. And I'm only going to talk about the Australian component of this. This study is occurring in 26 different countries around the world, and currently we're doing comparative analysis. And the results from this study essentially provided a basis for an alternative set of indicators developed from a child's standpoint, because it was a qualitative study. It is a qualitative study. So I then outlined some of the major themes of wellbeing which we identified in constructing this child's standpoint, and discuss some policy and service implications at the conclusion. Okay. So, in terms of approaches to monitoring children's wellbeing, so I'd say it's now quite common for monitoring agencies to combine both what are called objective and subjective measures in their efforts to monitor children's wellbeing. So objective approaches basically adopt material indicators to measure the social conditions of a particular population, while subjective approaches rely on an individual's assessment of how they're doing, and particularly of their quality of life. So the OECD, for example, which I suppose probably develops a framework which are then kind of cannibalised and adopted by state and federal governments everywhere, has developed a multi-dimensional monitoring framework which encompasses both. So in terms of their monitoring framework for children's wellbeing, they include objective indicators such as child poverty, living in a home without basic facilities, infant mortality rates, for example, PISA reading scores and so on, as well as subjective measures which are normally things like how do you feel based on a 7-point scale on things like your health status, the quality of your relationships, how things are going on at school. Now, the interesting thing about these monitoring frameworks, and despite the recognition of the importance of subjective wellbeing measures, most of the frameworks pretty much remain entrenched in what we can describe or are mainly focused on child development outcomes. What Ashi Ben-Ari, who's a kind of a leader in the monitoring field, has called well-becoming approaches. rather than wellbeing approaches. So typically in this research, knowledge is sought about children's wellbeing by focusing on whether children attain developmental milestones. And so whilst demonstrating a concern for children, they have been critiqued as being adult-centric because they view the child as an adult in deficit. The approaches have therefore raised some discontent about the use of these developmental indicators, whether objective or subjective, generally disregard individuals' own assessments of aspects of their quality of life and what they prioritise as potentially important. And this discontent has provided some impetus for alternative approaches to measuring children's wellbeing, including our own. So our project falls within this tradition. As I said, this is part of a much larger study. And basically, it's children in New South Wales in both rural and urban areas. And I want to skip over this now and we can talk about the methodology later on because researchers are generally interested in methodology and generally no one else is. So we can talk about what we came up with instead. How about that? Okay, so now as I said, there's a kind of a table floating around, and a fuller table in a much nicer form is presented in various publications, which I can send on to you. Now, so from what children told us, we built a picture, an initial picture, I suppose, of well-being based on three major themes. So what's important to understand here is that our methodology, and this is the only thing about methodology I'm going to talk about, basically involved multiple qualitative and very open approaches with children, getting them to tell us. We didn't test any concepts. It was pretty much open slavor. It was very child-directed. And they essentially, from what they told us, we could reconstruct three key domains: agency and autonomy, safety and security, and issues around the self. Okay? And within these themes, there are a number of sub-themes, some of which I have summarised here. Now, these three overarching domains are connected with other kind of dimensions, which are kind of concrete areas of children's lives which they prioritise as important to them. And these included economic wellbeing, health, and leisure. And I won't go into those today because I want to we only really have time to focus on these overall domains. And what I'm suggesting is that from there we then developed what we could describe as indicator concepts. These are kind of suggestions or pointers to, if you want to develop a set of outcomes based on children's own understandings of what's important for their well-being, these indicator concepts are essentially suggestions of what you should be collecting or potentially developing measures for. And you could develop these at the level of policy, at the level of data collection, and also at the level of service outcomes. And I suppose they can be read as a set of suggestions upon which outcome measures of children's wellbeing can be developed, and that also includes the track policy or as part of the service framework. Okay, so we've got agency. This is a summary of safety. So as you can see with agency, it's about self-determination and making a difference within relational context. I'll talk a little bit more about these in a moment. In terms of safety, we've got this notion of ontological security. I'll describe what that means in a moment. Safety at home, I know it's great, isn't it? You know, children as philosophers. And safe public spaces. And also in terms of the self, we've got issues or themes around the moral self, families as sites of dialogue, and friends and mutual acceptance and belonging. Okay, so what I want to do, and as I said, I can go into indicators more in a moment, but I want to talk about, or summarise, take a step back and say, how does this child standpoint differ in a way from existing monitoring frameworks, which probably many of you are quite familiar with. Or if not, they are probably informing the tick and flick assessments which you probably have to get funding for or need to demonstrate compliance as part of auditing processes to funders. Okay, so how does this differ? Okay, so firstly, a key implication of our study is to demonstrate that in some ways children's concepts of wellbeing are similar to the frameworks which pretty much dominate policy and service provision, but they also differ in very critical ways. And I want to talk about how they differ in terms of agency, safety and security in the sense of self. So regarding children's agency, service outcomes and policy have increasingly emphasised the value of children's participation in formal decision making. From our study, this is also important, and we've developed an indicator around that. But what was, I think, even more important was that children discussed the exercise of agency in everyday life, in everyday circumstances. So, for example, it's not about just being involved in formal decision-making. It's feeling as though you have ownership over the decisions that occur as part of the normal interactions. And I think you probably can all think about the service implications of that. And also, but they have some capacity to influence, organise and coordinate aspects of our everyday life. So if you relegate agency and participation just to formal decision making, this is not necessarily what children are prioritising when they talk about what's important to their well-being. Okay, regarding safety. Well, dominant frameworks, of course, revolve around risk assessment, risk management, risk prevention practices in child protection, and quite justifiably so. But as I said, children prioritise this notion of what we've described as ontological security, and this is feeling safe because people are just there around for you. There's a presence of having trusted adults in your life. And so this provides a sense or an atmosphere of being safe, of feeling secure. And children also emphasise how the way that most public spaces and places are designed, typically with adults in mind, often make them feel unsafe and limits their autonomy. So safety and autonomy from children's perspectives are highly related. They're not seen as necessarily as contrasting factors. So we attempted to capture this in things like children experience a sense of, I suppose, trust in others, ontological security, and also feel as though they can depend upon those who are tasked with their care, so that people aren't going to let them down. We also tried to capture this, that notion of physical safety in things like opportunities to access physical environments that facilitate a sense of freedom and enjoyment. Because what compromises a capacity to go out in the world in a fear-free way to play is that you feel as though your safety is compromised. And there may be some very real factors that compromise your safety. As well as, I think, which I haven't listed here, more traditional indicators which are about safety at home as well. Okay, so regarding the self, its third domain. So typically, as I already said, wellbeing frameworks are essentially really, well, they emphasise the importance of developing or attaining developmental milestones. And look, age-based developmental markers are often used as service outcome measures. They're often used as eligibility criteria. They're often used for auditing and tracking progress, and they're also used often as a criteria for service exit. But in our study, children emphasised something quite different about the self. They really emphasised the importance of being able to be moral, purposeful, and authentic individuals, and for opportunities in life for them to essentially develop this sense of self. And this is described as developed through relationships with adults and with other children. So we developed some concepts which essentially reflect this, and I can talk to you in more detail about it. Things like opportunities to develop their capabilities as moral agents, but their children are supported in the moral dilemmas they face, which we all do. And children talked about many of those moral dilemmas which they might encounter at home or at school or in their engagement in the service system, and they want to be supported in conversations with trusted adults to make their own decisions but develop their own moral autonomy, because they see trusted adults as being able to give them that kind of advice. And also this notion that families, that are broadly constituted, provide a site in which children can negotiate their changed sense of self. So this related to many discussions where children felt that their sense of self had developed, whereas those trusted adults, their idea of the child's sense of self was actually way behind. And this led to things like limitations on for autonomy and the kinds of responsibilities that they could exercise. Okay, so quickly I want to go on to the second feature. Well, and just very briefly talk about wellbeing as social and relational. This might seem important, but in the literature on, say, service provision for children, it's often overlooked. And this is a thing where children say, look, the thing which is most important to me in engaging with service providers was not necessarily the kinds of, sort of a formal policies and procedures, although they are very important, but it's the quality of the relationships and the engagement in the implementation of those services, which was critical. Now, one critical thing to point out here is that often children talk about things which are called hedonic wellbeing, fun, pleasure, things like this. And when, the kind of a stereotype of children when they talk about wellbeing is things like, I wish I had a PlayStation and stuff like that, right? Certainly that is an aspect of it. But what was probably more critical was the capacity for children to experience a whole range of emotions, things like sadness, frustration, and anger, which we often don't associate with well-being. But these were seen as well-being experiences because children, they felt it was attached to something important, and often those feelings could be worked through with important adults in their life to give them meaning. So essentially, these feelings of, for example, frustration or sadness or anger, often were about reaffirming social bonds. And when children discuss these emotions, these kind of contradictory emotions, often, with important adults, that confirmed their sense of what was important. Okay? So this is what we essentially mean as well-being as social and relational, and we've developed some indicators around, or indicator concepts around that as well. Okay, how are we doing with time? 4 minutes, okay. Right, so the third one, which I want to discuss before talking very briefly about well-being, or some implications for service providers, I suppose, is that at the beginning I said, look, we can differentiate between well-being outcomes and well-becoming outcomes. The well-being outcomes are what, say, children prioritise potentially in the here and now, and the well-becoming outcomes are often what we prioritise in terms of developmental outcomes. We would add to this what are called essentially, I suppose, practices associated with children's own aspirations, imaginings and definitions of their future. I don't know, I can't pithily summarise that into well-being or well-becoming. I know, what a mouthful, eh? But essentially this is about children being able to pursue in the here and now a kind of desired future, right? An imagined future. Right, a concept of self which they project into the future. And what they were telling us was that they would like systems and relationships in place that support them to essentially try and achieve those ends. Now that's quite different from developmental milestones, which are often associated with adult agendas, especially around educationalists in particular, and also parental and carer anxiety. Okay. All right, so finally, okay, some implications, and then I'll wrap it up. So, I would say what our indicator concepts attempt to do, they're just one attempt to convert some of the major themes developed from a child's standpoint into a framework that could inform policy and practice. So in terms of how children's understandings differ from popular scientific and policy discourses, our findings suggest that there are limits to the extent that current policy reflects children's understandings and experiences of well-being. And I think I've presented today an alternative set of themes that could inform child-centred service provision. When we think about the implications from our second theme of well-being as social and relational, it suggests the importance of children being able to engage in the full range of emotional experiences encountered in life, and the contextualisation of children of experience of well-being, things like sadness and adversity, suggests that whether negative feelings can be incorporated into an experience of well-being is very dependent on the relationships that these children rely upon with trusted adults, especially where these relationships are characterised by experiences of trust in others, oneself and one's environment, respect for one's own feelings and ideas, and inclusiveness, which are about facilitating agency in private and public spaces. And I think this is also relevant for work with children and young people. And finally, the implications of distinguishing between wellbeing and well-becoming for indicators of service provision is that whilst there's often an emphasis on developmental milestones as the basis of service outcomes for children, for example in case plans, services should also be mindful of how children experience the provision of the service and how the service impacts on their quality of life in the day-to-day. We also should be mindful of the significance of children's own aspirations and sense of purpose for their well-being, and thus how services, which are often required to limit their engagement with children on the basis of their program parameters, might further engage children and young people in a way that can support children's own ideas about their future. And that's where we'll leave it. Thank you.
Okay. Lovely, thank you. And certainly thank you. If anyone has any questions, we're happy to take those now. I'm not sure if we have a roaming mic person. I'm looking around. There is no roaming mic. Is there a roaming mic? Lovely. Any questions for Dr. Fattore? Great, thank you.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. Can you just explain what you mean by moral agents? Do you mean children being able to make decisions about what they see as right and wrong and resolving conflicts? Is that what you mean by a moral agent?
Yeah, look, that has a kind of a number of aspects. That's certainly one of those aspects. The other thing is about, what was interesting is about the need to also fulfil one's duties at home, to actually be what we would describe as obedient. Often, especially for younger children, was a demonstration of actually you want to be a good person for the people that you care about. And as a younger child, one way of demonstrating is that you do what essentially you try and be a good person at home and you fulfil those obligations. Now, of course, that has some ambivalent aspects to it. Another one, but as children, as sort of the older children in our study, were talking about resolving moral conflicts, but also then turned into a kind of a sense of justice about the world and trying to engage in things that would kind of meet that sense of justice. So it shows all those elements about conflict resolution, being good for the people that you care for, and also having and exhibiting a sense of justice.
Just a quick question about the age of the children
Yep.
you worked with.
Yep. Okay, so for this, but actually, it's a bit of a misnomer, really. We had some children who were 6 and 7, and actually some children who were 16 and 17, but the majority fell between 8 and 15 years. So quite a broad age range. So we went to various primary schools, high schools, youth services, youth centres, private homes, things like this. Yeah.
Are your findings available online?
Yep.
And did you use a specific model of community consultation to interact with them?
Our own one. But that's the methodology question. So as part of this study, and I think we might follow it up with kind of actually doing a comparative study in the multinational one, where we talk with trusted adults, and that could, in different contexts, as very different people. For example, we've got a Nepalese site, and that the people who are trusted adults there, for example, are quite different to here. So initially we just asked children we got them to map important people, places, activities, things, whatever it was. Just a mapping exercise, and they could do whatever they wanted. And that then became the site of the interview. So we got them to then explain the map. And then afterwards, if we analysed that data, we followed them up again, And we asked them, okay, so look, you talked about these themes. Can you tell us a little bit more about them? Are these the things which are still important for you? Why or why not? What would you add? So essentially what this does is that it then gets us to check or test our interpretations with the participants. And then we also gave them opportunities to do things like either make films, which they would then send, like digital pen pals, to our children in other parts of the world, which is kind of fun and an absolute nightmare to coordinate. Things like also focus groups, if they were young people, about some of the concepts in the quantitative studies, which we haven't really analysed yet, or if they had any ideas. So it's a multi-stage thing. Great.
Lovely.
Fantastic, thank you.
Thank you. Please put your hands together again for Dr. Fattore for his very interesting insights on child wellbeing and child becoming. And so it brings us to our second speaker, which is Annette Michaux, Director of the Parenting Research Centre. In this role, Annette leads significant evidence-informed practice and policy initiatives that help PRC clients achieve their intended outcomes. She leads PRC's work on influencing policy around parenting support and has directed the Reframing Parenting National Partnership since its inception in 2015. Annette has more than 16 years of executive-level experience in helping governments and organisations improve outcomes for children. Please welcome to the stage Annette. Thank you.
Hi everyone, it's great to be here and see some really familiar faces in the room too. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and also acknowledge any Aboriginal people in the room right here with us today. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for coming to this session. I'd like to acknowledge the authors, really, of this research, Nat Kendall-Taylor, who's the CEO of the Frameworks Institute, and Emily Lutz, who was the researcher on this project. They're actually based in Washington, DC, so that's why they couldn't be here today. But I feel like a real partner in this project because it's been something we've been working on for many years now. This wouldn't have happened without our fantastic project partners who've been along this journey with us. So the Department of Social Services, Department of Education and Training in Victoria, New South Wales Government, the Department of Community Services, and also the Benevolent Society. So thank you to those colleagues, particularly if you're in the room right now. And it's my absolute pleasure to present this incredibly exciting research. It's not very often that we get this kind of really rigorous approach to communications research. Often we're getting polling, we're getting focus groups. This is not that. This has a whole level of rigour to it, which is why it's really exciting to be sharing it with you today. And because it's actually incredibly important, all of us that are interested in improving outcomes for kids really need to think seriously about how we're communicating about parenting support. If we can tell a more compelling story, a positive story, a more supportive story, we're more likely to get support for our investments and indeed for our policies in the parenting support space. And most importantly for us today and for this TFM conference, we really need to find ways of ensuring that families feel less blamed and less guilty about coming forward early, because there's a lot of things getting in the way of that, and part of that is the way we communicate about parenting. So we know if we really want to overcome some of the barriers to having families getting the support they need, we need a more constructive and productive conversation about parenting in Australia. So just in case you haven't heard of the Parenting Research Centre, we're a national non-profit organisation and we help children thrive by driving new and better ways of supporting families in their parenting. And we do that with many people in the room. We work with governments and non-government organisations to achieve those goals. We're always working in partnership. This is our innovation cycle. We work in a number of areas to achieve those goals. Just to mention a couple, in New South Wales, we're the implementation partner in the implementation of Safe Care, which is being rolled out with 8 now different organisations funded by FACTS. Another example is the Intensive Family Support Program in Queensland, where we evaluated that big rollout that's been taking place for the last couple of years, and also the Links Trauma and Healing Service in New South Wales. We are really proud to be partnering with TFM in evaluating that program. So, reframing parenting. I might be a bit loud, sorry. I get excited about this research. I turn the volume up. This is really giving you 7 strategies, 7 ways to change and win hearts and minds. As all of us in the room know, the science on parenting is really quite strong and it's building. It's centrally important to anyone working with children because parenting effectively is so central and critical to child outcomes. And it was interesting to hear Toby talking earlier. For children to be developing those skills, to express themselves well, they need parents behind them and really functioning adults who can help them kind of enter the world and make great decisions about their lives. The research tells us that information about effective parenting, let alone the science or the study of parenting, evokes highly charged and divisive responses in the Australian public. Frameworks has conducted this research to help us understand how best to communicate, to build support for our programs and policies. And we're going to give you 7 ways, as I said, to progress this. Just to really clearly help you understand, this research was on the public, not just parents, and the public does recognise the importance of parenting, but few are aware of the science behind it or how some of the systemic solutions we're coming up with through things like TFM actually can improve outcomes for children. And the research compares public understandings of parenting with expert understandings and really and gives us some ways of bringing those views into alignment. It gives us some concrete and immediately usable strategies in how we communicate as well. And a lot of this information is on the Parenting Research Centre website. So why think about framing and how can we start reframing parenting? Well, really because sustained social change requires culture change. And the kind of change we're after requires some quite deep change at the level of public thinking, at the level of culture. Another way of saying this is that if we want to address social issues, the social issues we care about, we actually have to address how the public thinks. We know how much parenting matters, but we're also becoming increasingly aware that how we all think and talk about parenting is incredibly important too. And the way we talk about parenting needs much more effective messaging. We need a master narrative that's new and can be told in a way that addresses this public thinking. The underlying point here is that understanding is actually frame dependent, and advertisers and people in the communications field know this, and it's really important for us to understand how this can make a difference to how people understand things. And this is just an example from political science in the US, and this is the first frame people were given, and it's really about how would you feel about a hate group holding a rally. The importance of free speech is a really important frame in the US, and when people were given that frame as a way of thinking about this particular question, they were in favour of that rally going ahead. But when they were given the second frame, that frame around the risk of violence, it really reduced the number of people in favour. So this is just another example from a different field of how understanding is inherently frame dependent. This is also really important for us to think about because we also have a problem in our field, even though we probably agree on a lot of things around child development and around parenting. We as a sector are really delivering quite different messages. And this can be very confusing for politicians, but more so for the public. We probably need some really good strategies that help us move from the messy side to the arrow, where we're all communicating effectively with similar messages. So the reason we really need to think about framing is because we actually have a problem. And Frameworks talks a lot about this, where we and our colleagues, and probably many of us in the room, can agree on the importance of things like the early years, some of the elements of child development we can agree on. We can agree on the importance of, parenting skills, and most parents can become effective parents if we support them, even the most critically disadvantaged parents, and we all desperately agree on that. But something really strange happens when we talk about those messages to the general public. And one of the things that happens so this is Emily and Nat, and they went out on the streets of Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane and talked about parenting as a skill that can be developed.
I don't think there's such thing as a bad
This is what
parent.
people heard.
I think we're all doing the best we can.
There's not a rule book, there's not like a textbook for it. I don't think there's a obvious right or wrong way, do you know what I mean? I think it's just basic, love your child, provide.
If you care about your family and your kids, just stick with what your gut instincts are, and that's good.
Any parent that just gives their kids lots of love and attention would be a good parent.
But it's cyclical, isn't it? So like if you were raised by shitty parents, then you're probably going to turn out to be a shitty parent.
So these are some of the deep cultural models that the Australian public hold. So they'd been primed to have a message about skills and skill building, but what you hear is it's about natural caring, parenting's innate, it's instinctual. And also you heard the one about, well, if you were parented badly, you'll be a bad parent. We'll come back to that one. And this is just another example where we talked about some of the challenges in parenting, but we have got services and supports around parents. And this is the kind of response we got.
Well, I think one of the key trends right now is that we are going towards the US work culture. So maybe that's the other contributing factor where the time away from child is being taken away.
I think we forget guidelines now. We've got so many distractions with computers, etc., that we're not covering the fundamentals.
As someone growing up in the 21st century, I don't think there's as much face-to-face as there used to be.
The lack of real engaged community. I think it's a mad society we have now. It's so dominated by commercial imperatives.
I think that a lot of kids are arrogant little shits at the moment, and I think the parents don't discipline them, and I think that they don't even listen when they are disciplined. So I think it's a complete breakdown in discipline from the generations now.
Okay, so again, you're hearing a lot of what we call the swamp of public understanding, some of the unproductive thinking that's held in the Australian public. And what is that thing in the middle that's getting in the way of people kind of hearing our messages? It's culture. It's these deep, intrinsic ways of thinking that we actually share as a community. This is a kind of an Australian way of thinking about parents and parenting that we share. And some of the things we think about are productive, but quite a few of them get in the way of people hearing about the science of parenting, and that parenting can be changed and parents can be supported. And JFK put it beautifully when he talked about the great enemy of truth very often not being the lie, contrived, dishonest, etc., but the myth, persistent, persuasive and unrealistic. So we are up against these myths when we try and get our messages across about effective parenting. So what are these 7 ways to win hearts and minds? This research was combined with some research that was done a little bit earlier around the early years and resulted in about 15,000 Australian respondents. So there is quite a body of evidence around this communications research now. We started in 2015 where we mapped the gaps between public and expert understandings, got those deep cultural understandings. And the second piece of research was testing some new ways of talking about parenting and coming up with some strategies that are on our website, but I'll also brief you on now. So the first part was really about understanding the swamp, which you heard a little bit in those snippets from on the street. interviews. What is that deceptive green bubble of culture that's morphing the meaning and the message that we're trying to get across? Couple that I'll draw out now that I guess are particularly relevant for a child welfare context. If the general public see parenting as something that's about natural caring, they also talked about good people are good parents. This has a couple of really important effects, I guess. If people see parenting as innate, as natural, it really gets in the way of people who might be struggling a bit. So if you're struggling, you're seen as unnatural, you're a bad person, and this tends to vilify parents, okay? And secondly, it's very deterministic. If it comes naturally, then it means it's hard to change. How you're parented determines your parenting as well. There's a very strong determinism in the public thinking. This way of understanding is highly fatalistic, and it's very important for you as an audience to think about what impact might this have. If we're talking about vulnerable people a lot, some of the TFM cohorts, what impact might this have on how people understand what we're trying to do? It really also restricts how people see programs like yours, and it means that people don't really trust that we can make any difference to families at all. So again, this is the general public's view. In this, there's also 3 models of government. 2 are quite unproductive and 1's productive. Government as an outside director, government as a partner, government as incapable. So in our communications, we really want to trigger that government as a partner. And you heard that in the snippets from young people where one of the young people talked about the support they'd got from government, things like the dentist, etc. So if this is the swamp and we need to really address some of these ways of thinking, what do we need to do? Well, the second phase of the research was really looking at what are some messages that we can test to see if we can find a more effective and productive way of talking about parenting. Quite a sophisticated methodology was used involving the design of what we call candidate metaphors, so messages and frames that we tested empirically on about 7,000 Australians, followed by persistence trials to check whether people were able to tell stories to each other to see if those stories worked. And changing culture and attitudes really requires a big idea that's going to work. This master narrative gives an audience information about what the problem is, what the issue's about, and what the solution is. So identifying this effective master narrative was like our holy grail, and we were desperately worried that we wouldn't be able to find something, but luckily enough, we found one, and it was really statistically significant. So, and it's quite, the other wonderful thing about this big idea change is that it's really quite simple. It's moving from a narrative around effective parenting. This is really big news for the Parenting Research Centre, where we talk about effective parenting a lot, and moving to a narrative around child development. So from effective parenting and to child development. And what does this reframe actually look like at a practical level? It moves us from statements like this: we need to invest in programs that support effective parenting, to messages like this. And you can see we're just turning it around. We're putting children first. We're talking about raising healthy children, and the way to do this is by supporting parents. So it's changing the messages around. And was this effective? Above the line is good, below the line is bad. That's my basic stats. So we tested this empirically, and what we found was that the orange above the line is when we used that child development frame. And that frame led to people positively supporting parenting support policies, things like financial support, free childcare, parenting centres. So a really statistically significant support for the idea of supporting parents when you put child development first. Really interestingly though, and quite worryingly, when you come from an effective parenting frame, it actually reduces support for policies. So that very strong deterministic view, that very strong view of parents they really should know how to do it. If we come from an effective parenting frame, we get a decline in support for policies. And this is the behavioural question: would you support higher taxes if they were supporting, if they were around supporting children? And also, would you engage in civic action? Again, the child development frame led to a positive reaction to that. The effective parenting frame, people were less likely to support those things. So this really is quite a significant piece of evidence around how to communicate. The third point is around being really careful about judging parents. And for us, the message is don't inadvertently do it. I don't think we tend to blatantly do it in this way. So this is psychologist Michael Carr-Gregg, I know many of you know him, lashes out against crappy parenting in a new book. It's all about blaming parents for problems with children. And this is a West Australian example. Poor parenting can harm kids. It's an educationalist talking about, you know, if kids are struggling at school, their parents aren't there for them, they're going to end up in jail. So very deterministic example of how this is really framing the public discourse. So a bit less obvious here, and this is from a credible parenting resource. What you see here is the opening is about children looking up to parents and family members and copy what they do, some ways to be a good role model, then we go through some positive parenting. So again, we're priming people and being quite subtly judgmental. This is with a frame around what kids need, so we're reframing it to child outcomes here. Children learn by interacting with those around them. They need caregivers who model positive behaviours and engage with them in productive ways. So we've taken out the word good, effective, because that really gets in the way of people hearing our messages. The fourth message is about using a metaphor that actually helps people get a mental image that shifts their thinking. Actually, I'll come back to that in a sec. So we tested a range of potential metaphors to try and find one that really worked. What I said earlier around people seeing parenting as natural and innate makes it really hard for people to understand the social and economic context that actually profoundly impacts parenting. The research showed us that people think making individual choices about their parenting and how they were parented are the only determining factors. So it's a choice, but anyway, how you're parented is going to lead to how you parent. So reframing parenting really needs an effective way of people understanding that parenting is contingent on a whole lot of other factors, and it's affected by systems and contexts. And framing means we talk about a lot of metaphors. Frameworks Institute develops these metaphors and then tests them. So we needed one that would bring social conditions into view. So we developed the navigating waters metaphor and tested it. And this metaphor works really well because it helps people understand that parenting is affected by things that come along like sailing on rough waters. A storm can come along and rock the boat, so you need safe harbours, and they equate to things like financial supports, counselling services, childcare services, where all children can get the support they need in times of rough seas. And so it really helps strategically direct people away from that individualism, from natural parenting, and from that fatalism about there's nothing we can do. And this is just, again, some examples from the members of the public were given the metaphor, and this is how they played it back.
What does the analogy tell you about the things that influence the way that people parent?
Life is very tumultuous, and especially if you have a child to care for.
You may have some rough seas.
And there will be those storms, you know, where you think, well, this is it, you know, I can't get out of this.
Yes, I think, you know, there are rough seas along the way.
What are those rough seas that rock the boat?
Anxiety and stress affects people's ability to parent and children as well.
Completely did not think of this, but I completely agree that it's social situations, the emotional stress.
The unknown very much depends on the the psyche and the character of the child as well.
If a parent loses their job, or a father loses their job, or whoever is providing for the family, and it's out of their control, you know, that might be considered a very big wave.
If you've got no money and no job, and you're going to struggle.
A different cultural background, discrimination, poverty, stress.
Different life stages, things that might happen to you, like marriage breakdowns.
But there are also those supports of lighthouses and harbours that you could go to, when you hit those stormy seas, little retreats that you could lean on for support.
Are there things that could improve parenting in Australia?
You need to enlist people to help you, and hopefully you're not on that boat alone.
Any sort of help and support along the way would be good.
Creating more of a community around it.
I guess if you get more crew on your boat.
But if you do have the right tools and support, it'll make it easier.
If you're living in a community, though, that has good environment, everything around it is good. You know what I mean? Where people are going out to work and everyone gets along better.
Creating those lighthouses is just a reminder to people that there could be supports available.
Family or support from society or support from the government.
Support groups, there should be communication education.
Or maybe people could just get their boats together, and navigate together through the ocean.
So it's beautiful, isn't it, that people, we can really draw on some more productive ways of thinking. Australians do understand what surrounds us, shapes us. They just hadn't been applying it to parenting. But given the right story, it's very powerful the way people can understand that context actually affects parents, and people do need support. So I'll just sum up by going through the fifth one, that order is everything. So it's not that you can't talk about the need to improve parenting skills, but you do need to start with child development. You do need to give people some understanding that context is important, that parenting is contingent upon a range of factors. So don't lead with effective parenting, because it absolutely leads you into rejection of the message or blaming parents. The other factor, and that's my timer telling me to stop, is what I just said around what's around just shapes us. Very briefly, it's really important to not just tell people that child development and parenting is important, but to explain it. And we've got a couple of really useful metaphors that have been tested in Australia. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the brain architecture metaphor. Brains aren't born. They are developed and made through interactions like serve and return. So actually giving people the how, not just telling them the what, is incredibly important. And just finally, we now have this new master narrative. Why does parenting matter? Start with child development. What threatens it? Well, the stormy seas threaten it. And using the serve and return and the brain architecture metaphor to explain development. And really, what do we need to do? What's the call to action? Well, we need policies that support parents. So that's the 7 ways. I just refer you to our website. So these materials, there's a toolkit that gives you some ideas about how to use some of these messages. You've got a couple of things on your seats, some advance and absolutely avoid messages. So for example, stop talking about how hard parenting is. It's a really bad message and we've all done it. So just don't do it anymore. And all these things are available on our website. So thank you so much for your time.
So inviting the audience for any questions for Annette. Yep, just down here at the front.
I was just wondering where we can get access to more information on the 7 things. Is that all kind of explicitly published and spelt out on your website?
Yeah, the toolkit really explicitly spells it out. You can phone us and talk to us more as well. But yes, that's all on the website. And I should say also that there's a number of organisations that are taking this on now. So nationally, the national campaign that DSS is running is going to use these messages. The NAPCAN Child Protection Week campaign is using these messages. I know Sydney LHD, Belinda Power is here today, have been talking about using these messages. So there are a number of people who are taking this further. So there's opportunities to join in this kind of movement of change. But we're really keen to make sure people really get access to the toolkit. And if there's anything you don't understand, just please contact me.
That's great. My colleague and I also both just sort of shared that we could have listened to you talk all day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. One more question, just over here.
I wanted to ask you how you saw the concept of the self-sufficient nuclear family playing out in the parenting message.
I think it plays out. Actually, it plays out quite strongly on a couple of levels. One is that kind of, what's a good family look like? The moral good family is a family. Yeah, I think there's quite a lot there. But we also found that both mums and dads were important. But when the public spoke to us about parenting when things were going wrong, it was always mum who was responsible. So that played out quite strongly in the research, actually. So what we're suggesting is and people are doing this a lot more, using examples of dads with their children, and finding different ways of kind of illustrating families. It's great to see actually in Their Futures Matter materials, there's a lot of kind of positive imagery. It's not that imagery of the dark kind of disadvantaged family. But I think it played out quite a lot. We did have quite broad the sample we used was actually representative, but it did play out.
Great. Thank you. Please put your hands together for Annette. And our final speaker for this breakout session is Carol Markie-Dadds, Head of Strategic Policy with Triple P International. Carol holds responsibility for supporting government and non-government agencies to close the gap between policy, research and practice in the use of evidence-based programs from the Triple P Positive Parenting Program. Carol held senior positions in strategic policy, research and implementation teams with the Queensland Government in the Department of Education and Training and Premier in Cabinet. As an Executive Director with the Office of Early Childhood Education and Care, she was responsible for early years policy and legislation, implementation of statewide reforms and regulation of early childhood education and care services. Please welcome Carol.
Thank you for that introduction, Sylvia. And thank you for having me here today. I'm quite excited to be presenting today. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and a warm welcome to Indigenous people that are here with us today. So I'd like to continue the theme today that Annette led off about helping children thrive by supporting parents. But just a couple of clarifications or disclosures about Triple P International. We're a social enterprise private company with a worldwide licence to disseminate the Triple P Positive Parenting Program. The University of Queensland holds the copyright of Triple P and receives royalties from TPI, which is shared with the authors. And I just wanted to note that I am an author of some of the Triple P materials. Well, I don't think with this audience that we have today that I need to convince anybody about the importance of parenting and the powerful influences that it has on children's lives. But it's important to note that good parenting is a skill, so it can be learned. And it also has the potential to mediate against the effects of social disadvantage. However, we do need to acknowledge that when a child's exposed to multiple disadvantages, the effects of poor parenting are multiplied. So like Annette, I'd like to focus on one of the big questions today, which is more about how do we reach those children and families who need the most support in a way that is positive and supportive rather than punitive and stigmatising. So I'd like to take a look at the power of positive parenting for children and parents as individuals as well as for communities. So this is just a reminder of some of the benefits of positive parenting. So it's important, the red box in the middle, the quality of that parent-child relationship, the attachment, the nurturing, the bond, the love, the caring between the parent and the child, and the parenting practices shape a child's social, emotional and behavioural development. And in turn, those impact on the physical and mental health outcomes of the child, the educational outcomes for that child, their future employment outcomes, how well they get on with others and the relationships that they have with significant others later in life, their influence with alcohol and drugs, or whether or not one comes into contact with the criminal justice system. But it's important to note that our ability to parent is impacted by many factors. So the social determinants of health, economic factors, relationship and attachment factors, our own experiences of adversive childhood experiences and trauma, cultural factors, biological factors and so on, our expectations, beliefs, our cognitions that we have. So if we're going to ensure that every child has the opportunity to thrive by supporting parents, then we need to recognise that different families have different needs and there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to supporting parents. So we're looking at the Triple P system as a model of, proportionate universalism, borrowing from Marmot's concept from the UK. The idea behind the system providing a public health or population health approach to supporting parents is to ensure that there is support for all families, but more support for those with the greatest need. So just in terms of, I'll share a little bit about my involvement with Triple P, which started back in the early 90s as a new psych graduate, where we were really focused, the team involved with the Triple P program, on the level 4 and 5, really the pointy end of the triangle. And it's not really surprising that we were up at that end looking at families who were presenting with clinical levels of child emotional and behavioural problems, because we were clinical psychologists and involved in the treatment and support of families presenting. My particular interest at that time was on self-help versions of intensive parenting family support. And back in that time, early 90s, was when we had the first randomised controlled trial with 300 odd families who participated in different versions of the level 4 and 5 Triple P programs. We then started to expand our development of programs to look at, well, how can we reach more families in less time? So the development of the group program, and then more briefer interventions that GPs and child health nurses could use as part of their well child checks. Queensland Health then took on Triple P in the late 90s, and I was lucky to be the project coordinator for the rollout of, the level 3 and group Triple P through our community child health centres. So that introduced me to a whole new world of government public policy. So that's where I got all excited about changing the world and jumped ship from Triple P and worked in social policy within the education departments and Premier and Cabinet for a few years. At the same time, the Triple P team continued developing further down the triangle to develop more of that proportionate universalism approach. So getting briefer interventions that could be delivered in as short as 90-minute seminars, but reaching hundreds of parents at a time. And I guess this approach of proportionate universalism, it's not it's quite common in government social policy, where government's looking at trying to engage the most vulnerable families in a particular social policy. So it's often in health with our child health checks that everybody's entitled to a minimum level of support, and then more targeted home visits and so on are offered to those families that are perhaps more vulnerable. And that was where I got involved in the universal rollout of kindergarten in Queensland, where we had a platform that there was free kindergarten for all, or preschool, as you call it down in New South Wales. So the free 15 hours a week of early education for our 4-year-olds. And that was provided as a minimum, and then there was extra supports for those families that needed more support to access that educational program. So there was fee relief or extra early access for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders children could access when they were 3. So I'm now excited to be working with governments and Triple P now about trying to get a proportionate universalism or population public health approach to parenting support in social policy agendas. I thought it's also worth noting that although it's a triangle and often there's a correlation of the more disadvantaged families at the top of the triangle, they're not all up there. I think it's important to note that just because families have complex problems, they don't always need complex solutions. There's a lot of research showing the effectiveness of brief targeted interventions for families who are in quite complex and challenging situations. One that's been some research that I was reading recently was just using 2-hour discussion groups with parents on a real specific topic like bedtime routines or mealtime routines, things that we all have to do as parents every day, over and over. And using that 2-hour approach within homelessness shelters within the US and having very positive outcomes for those participants. Most of those women or mothers in those centres were escaping family violence situations. But having a shared language and a common approach, they all needed to get their children to sleep at night in the emergency shelter. They all needed to have their children eating their meals and having a morning routine. So those sorts of interventions can be very effective in a light touch way. And I guess part of the reason why Triple P works is it's about the approach underpinning how we work with families, how we work with practitioners, how we work with parents, and then how parents work with children using a self-regulatory approach. What is the least we can do to get in and support this family, help them with some options, and then lead them to make decisions about what sort of parenting strategies they want to use with their family, what are the goals that are important for their family, what are the behaviours that they want to encourage, what does a meal routine look like for that particular family. The other important thing about having a model where you're trying to reach the population is the ability for scalability, I guess, of the workforce. So this is looking at 3 different levels of service intervention. So if we follow the usual model of working with families, running a number of group programs per year, see about 40 families over 5 years, see about 200 families. The same practitioner could use their time to provide some intensive interventions like group programs that run over 8 weeks or 10 weeks or so, as well as one-off seminars or online programs, self-help programs to see a lot more families. And if they even throw in more of those sort of discussion group, topic-specific programs, they can use essentially the same number of contact hours that they were using to see families in their group programs, but they're seeing a much greater proportion of families in their careers. And I guess it's important to keep, the sustainability of the workforce as well, that it's more interesting for the practitioners if they're doing a variety of delivery methods as well, rather than just one-on-one with a family and seeing maybe 20 families a year. So just to clarify what we mean when we talk about a population approach to supporting parents and I guess impacting on the level of child behaviour and emotional problems in the community. This is just your bell curve for the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire, a common tool used for assessing social emotional adjustment of children. If we had 1,500 children under this bell curve, there'd be this, point up here, 119 children identified as being in the clinical range. Now, if we were able to support those families and move the mean here, 1 standard deviation down, what would be the impact on the percentage of children that are falling within the clinical range. So here we're moving at half a standard deviation is to the red, and then a full standard deviation to the yellow. Oops, I think I hit the wrong button. So if we've moved the mean down, we've got only 79 children rather than 119 falling within the clinical range. And so the impact of that is a 34% reduction in the number of children identified as having a mental health disorder. And the cost saving to government and community, millions of dollars, that's just based on the assumption of about $260,000 per child that has conduct disorder from around age 10 to 25, providing support and services to those families. So that's what we're trying to do with a population approach, is really move the mean of the prevalence rate of disorder down. There's some compelling evidence now for this sort of a population approach. I guess the main study was in South Carolina. It was the first of its kind to demonstrate that treating parenting as a public health issue could improve child outcomes at a countrywide population level, and that research in South Carolina was focused on child maltreatment outcomes. So they had 18 counties in South Carolina, 9 were randomly allocated to care as usual, and 9 implemented a population health approach to parenting support. In Ireland, their focus in the Central Midlands area was on mental health outcomes for children, so they were using the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire as their outcome measure. In Western Australia, back in the late 90s, they had the group parenting support program for all parents with a 3-year-old child in disadvantaged areas of Perth. Quite recently, the 15-year follow-up data came out to show significant improvements or benefits associated for those children whose parents had been through the parenting support. So literacy and numeracy scores on the old WAPLAN back then, and also attendance data and emergency hospital visits. Santa Cruz has been doing a huge significant reform similar to their Futures Matter approach to looking at how to help the most vulnerable families. In Santa Cruz, in California, they had the highest average for child maltreatment notifications. They've turned the curve in terms of child health and wellbeing at a population level. They're finding data that those families who participate in parenting support are making significant changes. The program is responsive to a diverse range of families. Brief, light touch services are effective, and the improvements last long after the services have ended. So in the time that Triple P was launched, Santa Cruz's rate of substantiated allegations of child maltreatment has decreased and remained well below the state rate now since 2012. So the beauty of the system of providing the parenting support is that parenting affects so many outcomes for children and parents and communities. So with one approach, it's having a multitude of benefits for those that are participating directly, as well as the community at large. There's also significant financial benefits or economic benefits for investing in early intervention and prevention, and I'm sure I don't need to convince this group of that. I guess the next part, though, is how do we take parenting support to scale, and how do we engage those families that are most likely to benefit from accessing support? So taking a population health approach means taking it to the parents, to universal access points, those everyday settings where parents congregate. So today, this means going to our schools, and in particular now, our early childhood education and care settings, with universal access to preschool and kindergarten, excuse me. So going to our preschools, particularly now that we're going to have
universal access to kindy for 4-year-olds and for 3-year-olds in many of the states, and the federal government agenda is moving that way as well. It's also important that we provide for programs online. I think we need to recognise that parents or children that have been born, or even my children now, 20 years of age, are digital natives. They've grown up with technology. So I think it was some of the research that your centre put out, Annette, 79% of parents are searching for parenting information and support online. So we need to lower any barriers to access by creating the ways of accessing the program that parents tell us that they want to access it. I think another thing is that judgy word that you had on your slide. When our research at looking at why parents want to do online programs, it's because they don't want to be judged in a group. They don't want to share, at this point, their parenting experience with others. So they're looking for an online option where they can do it privately and at a time and place of their choosing. So in Queensland, our focus has been on, we have a significant population health rollout of parenting support through the Triple P program. We've been very fortunate to be funded through the Queensland Government since June 2015, with their public policy commitment making evidence-based parenting support freely available to all families with a child under 16. The full system, levels 1 to 5, a huge communications campaign, but I do think we need to look more at your reframing research and the messages that we're putting out to help attract families to engage with the program that we have on offer. In the first couple of 3 years, we've had 800 so practitioners who've completed training in Triple P. What's really important is that we don't want a bolt-on approach. We've been working with organisations who are funded to provide parenting and family support, whether that's funded through DSS or through our Department of Communities, Child Safety or other Queensland Government agencies. And we're offering them tools for their toolkit so they can provide a range of evidence-based parenting support to the families that they come into contact with. So we're not looking at funding people to deliver Triple P per se. It's about delivering evidence-based programs, of which Triple P is one of the programs that we're putting in their toolkit. So when we're working with families, or practitioners I should say, we're working with agencies to co-design what the parenting support could look like in their organisation. So do they have the potential to provide brief light touch seminars to large groups of people? If they don't have a venue with adult chairs, we'd say no. And look at other ways in which they could deliver parenting support to their families. What's really important, we can give you some reach figures, thanks. So great, we're getting bums on seats, we're getting engagement from parents, 260,000 parents and carers have accessed the program. Interestingly, over 45,000 of those have accessed it online. We've got we do have a research trial being done through the University of Queensland and an ARC linkage project, so we'll get some more outcome data down the track, but we're not expecting much different to what was achieved in Ireland. But one of the questions we always get asked is, are we reaching diverse families? So and this was one of the criteria for getting funding in Queensland, we were given funding for the first couple of years and asked to report on our reach of vulnerable families as defined by the Queensland Government. So the profile is the characteristics the government was looking at as being important. The target is the community representation within Queensland. Reach 1 shows the percentage that we were attracting in the first couple of years of the project, and Reach 2 is in this last year of the project. And the reason why I separated the data into those two groups was just to show that over time we're attracting even more vulnerable families the longer that the initiative is in place. So yes, we do attract probably the less vulnerable in the first 6-12 months of the rollout, but over time, as word gets out, more and more families who would be deemed to be vulnerable are accessing support. It's also really important that we're tailoring our approaches to the local community context. We're very fortunate to have, wrong button again. Michelle Forster is one of our team members, an Indigenous implementation consultant. She's been with us since the start of the project, and lucky for her, I think, we've just hired another Indigenous implementation consultant who started with us earlier this year. Michael Hurd has probably become our main trainer for working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups of practitioners and developing the skills and competencies to deliver culturally safe and appropriate training courses. And Michelle is always at those courses as well. And I guess with working with Indigenous families and organisations, we've heard these messages before. So it's about co-design and walking with these practitioners and elders in their organisations to look at what they're after, and is there something that we can do within our system of programs to support them? What would it look like in their community? And then providing that really culturally safe training, noting that for some families or practitioners at those courses are going to have had adverse childhood experiences and trauma issues may be raised as part of the course. Just two more slides. The last one was just to show you about P Online. Again, surprising some of the reach figures that we're getting. It surprises me that families with a language other than English, over 12% are opting to do the online program. A relatively high number of Indigenous families are also opting to do the online program. So I think it's important that we don't let our practitioner gatekeeping to determine who it is that we offer some of the supports and programs to, that we make it freely available, and then it's up to those families to choose and select the level of support, the intensity and the format of the support that they wish to access. There's been, just in terms of outcome data, this is data embedded within the program, so families completing the online program rate their confidence or skill to deal with common parenting issues at the start of the program and again at the end. Significant improvements on their ratings of 1 to 10, so they start off with a mean rating around 5 to 6, a bit neutral, and feeling around the 8 to 9 in terms of confidence to deal with parenting situations. And importantly, not all of those parenting situations are covered in the online program, but we give them the tools to apply the strategies to any parenting scenario. So they're feeling that they've developed the skills sufficiently that they could apply them to situations or parenting scenarios that aren't covered in the program. There's been 6 randomised trials now with P Online to show its effectiveness if anyone's interested in some more information about that program. And the last thing, it's really important that we work together to achieve multi-level approaches, to achieve outcomes for the population. We need multi-level approaches. We need the top end for those families that are at the pointy end of the triangle, but we also need the light touch, brief, universal support messages. And a lot of the communications messages that Annette was putting out as well, how do we start to get a conversation within the community about the importance of parenting through a child development lens to develop parent skills. And we also need to offer multiple delivery options so parents can access the support in the format that suits them. As we've said, we need to normalise participation in parenting support to engage those who are most likely to benefit. So thank you.
I think we have time for one question. Or none. That's okay. Thank you. Another round of applause. Thank you so much, Carol. And thank you to all our presenters for taking part in this breakout session. Their insights have helped us to understand a child's sense of wellbeing and how we can provide better support for parents to raise healthy kids who are empowered to reach their potential. So we will now break for afternoon tea, and we'll be back here in this theatre at 3:10 for a very interesting final session. So please join us here again this afternoon. Thank you.